The gift came in a white box no bigger than a bakery box, tied with a gray ribbon my wife had ironed flat with her thumb before setting it beside my coffee. I remember that part because it was my 42nd birthday, because rain kept tapping the kitchen windows as if someone polite were trying not to interrupt us, and because Nora would not look at me in the easy way she usually did. She looked at the box instead. When I loosened the ribbon, she said very quietly, "It isn't a joke," and something in my chest turned so hard and fast that for a second I thought I might be sick right there at our yellow kitchen table with the chipped salt shaker and the damp dish towel hanging over the oven handle. Inside the tissue paper was a soft blue blouse, a charcoal cardigan, and a narrow silver barrette. Nothing flashy, nothing theatrical, nothing like the cruel little costume my fear had prepared for. They were ordinary things, tasteful things, chosen with the kind of care that meant she had pictured me in them. Under the cardigan was a note torn from the back of an electric bill envelope. It said, "I bought what you might have chosen for yourself if no one had ever taught you to be ashamed." Even now, years later, I can still feel the exact temperature of my coffee going cold between my hands while I try to decide whether my marriage had just ended or my life had finally begun. What I understood that morning, though not all at once, was that Nora had not given me clothes. She had given me a witness. The strangest part is that I had spent most of my life believing discovery would arrive like an explosion, some dramatic confession, some unforgivable exposure. Instead, it arrived in tissue paper, in rainlight, in my wife's handwriting on the back of a bill, and it changed everything because it forced me to reckon with how long I had been visible to the person I loved most while remaining hidden from myself. When I think about where that morning really began, I do not start with the box. I start in my grandmother's laundry room, where I was 6 years old and small enough for the wicker basket to seem almost architectural, a thing with walls and shadow and secret softness. My grandmother dried clothes on a line in winter because she mistrusted dryers, said they made people impatient and linens rough. Her basement always smelled faintly of starch, pennies, and the onions she kept in a mesh bag by the stairs. While the grown-ups talked upstairs after Sunday dinner, I would drift down there and touch what was hanging. Not in the furtive way I would later learn to use with myself, not yet. Then it was simple. My grandmother's slips were cool and whisper-thin, my mother's blouses had pearl buttons like tiny bones, my aunt's scarf carried a powdery perfume that seemed to belong to composure itself. I didn't have language for any of it. I only knew there were textures that quieted me and others that seemed to make my body louder. Corduroy boys' pants scratched and announced themselves with every step. The softer things seemed to let me disappear and appear at the same time. Once my grandmother came down and found me holding one of her pale aprons against my chest. She did not gasp. She did not laugh. She said, "If you're going to help, at least hand me the clothespins." And I remember the flood of relief being so strong it felt like luck. For years I would revisit that moment as proof that I had imagined the danger later, that perhaps I could have lived more simply if life had remained in the basement with the onions and clothespins. But tenderness given by one older woman in one quiet house is not always strong enough to survive the rest of a family. At 8, I spent a Saturday at my aunt Denise's while my parents helped my grandfather replace shingles. Denise had 3 daughters and a house full of elastic bands, dull brushes, tights draped over radiators, barrettes left in ashtrays because adults still smoked then, and no one cared where anything was as long as supper happened on time. My cousin Leah wanted to play school, but not the kind where children sat at desks.
She wanted costumes.
She tied a sash around my waist, pushed my arms through one of her old recital cardigans, and clipped my hair back with 2 pink snaps because, as she said, the teacher needs to look neat. I can still see myself in the hallway mirror, slightly crooked, knees knobby, ears too big, and yet more recognizable to myself in that instant than I had ever been in my stiff collared shirts. Then my mother came to pick me up early. She stood in the doorway with her purse still on her shoulder and smiled at first, because all adults smile when they think children are being silly. But the smile changed when she saw my face. It was not outrage. It was something more complicated, and because it was more complicated, more enduring. It was the expression of someone suddenly realizing that a joke may not be a joke to everyone involved. In the car, she didn't scold me. She only said, Let's keep some games at cousins' houses, all right? And I said okay, because even then I knew an ordinary sentence could carry a border inside it. My father never had to tell me I had crossed that border. My mother's careful tone did it for him. A year later, he did say something, and his words lodged in me more deeply because they were about posture, not clothing, which meant there was nowhere to hide from them. We were at the dinner table, my brother Eric kicking my shin under the tablecloth to make me spill milk, my mother pretending not to notice because she believed boys solve themselves if you didn't interrupt too often. I had one hand curled at my wrist while I spoke, copying without knowing it the gesture of my Aunt Denise, who always seemed to make even grocery lists sound elegant. My father looked up from his roast and said, "Don't do that with your hand. Sit straight. Sit like a boy." It was a small correction by the standards of fathers I later heard about. He did not shout. He did not strike the table. He returned to his dinner. But it was the first time I understood that masculinity was not only something expected of me, it was something being audited in real time. After that, I began studying myself from the outside. I learned that shame does not always begin as hatred. Sometimes it begins as surveillance. I was 11 when I discovered the mirror could be more dangerous than any person. I stayed home with a fever on a Thursday in October. My mother left saltines on the nightstand and went to work, trusting me because I had always been the child who obeyed instructions, even in private. Around noon, I wandered into her room looking for a blanket because mine smelled of cough syrup. Her closet door stood open, and one of her long house cardigans hung near the front, beige and almost shapeless, the kind of garment no one would have called glamorous. I put it on because I was cold. That is still the cleanest truth I can tell about how it began that day. But I did not take it off after I was warm. I stood in front of her mirror with the cardigan tied loosely over my pajamas and felt a kind of stillness that was not childish dress-up and not exactly happiness either. Happiness would have been too simple. It was recognition without explanation. I looked less impressive, less defined, and somehow more coherent. When I heard the garage door, I tore it off so fast I nearly ripped a seam, then spent the rest of the afternoon afraid my mother would notice the sleeves were stretched, afraid she would not notice, afraid of what each possibility meant. She noticed nothing. That, too, taught me something. Secrecy can survive not because people are fooled, but because families are often busy preserving larger stories about themselves. In ours, the larger story was that Eric was the difficult one. My father was the stern one, my mother the mediator, and I was the easy son, the one who made trouble unnecessary. Once that role attached itself to me, it became a hiding place and a prison at once. Middle school gave me a new kind of misery, the public kind that thrives on comparison. Eric grew shoulders early and spoke in a blunt, careless voice that got mistaken for confidence. I learned instead to anticipate other people's moods, to laugh half a second after everyone else so my timing looked natural, to hold books in front of my chest in the hall as if that posture meant studiousness rather than protection. The first humiliation that truly marked me came during a school play. One of the girls got sick before a dress rehearsal, and because I was the tallest among the boys who could be trusted to read clearly, the teacher told me to stand in and carry her lines while they fixed spacing on stage. She draped a shawl around my shoulders so the blocking would make sense. The room laughed in the way children laugh when permission has been granted by an adult accident. I laughed too. Then the teacher, distracted and practical, said, "Honestly, he's the only one who's moving naturally." The laughter shifted.
It sharpened.
I do not think she meant anything by it beyond stage direction, but to a 13-year-old starving for clues and terrified of them, it sounded like an accusation disguised as praise. That afternoon on the bus, a boy named Darren asked if I wanted to borrow lip gloss next time. He was not especially cruel. He was merely pleased with his own timing. I shrugged as if nothing touched me. That night, I practiced walking in my room, lowering my shoulders, widening my stance, trying to edit the very mechanics of my body. People imagine concealment as silence. Often it is choreography. At 15, I tried the oldest remedy boys are offered for uncertainty: more boyhood. I joined track because my father respected measurable effort, and because I believed exhaustion might scrub something out of me. There was a brief season when it almost worked. Running gave me a script. Eat, practice, shower, study, sleep. My calves hardened, my father nodded at race times, and for a few months I mistook numbness for progress. But denial that seems to work often works only because it leaves no room to notice what it has cost. One Friday after a meet, the team stopped for burgers. The boys were talking about girls, not romantically exactly, but with a casual ownership teenage boys practice before they know what love requires. One of them asked which actress I'd marry if I could. I made up an answer. Then another said I asked questions about women's clothes like my mother was training me for pageants. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. I always knew how to laugh at the right moment. But when I got home, I stood in the bathroom looking at my mud-splashed legs and felt not masculine, not cleansed, not saved, only further away from whatever quiet truth had visited me in mirrors and basements and borrowed softness. The body I was disciplining had become one more costume, only sweatier, and more socially approved. Around that time, my mother started taking me on errands when Eric was grounded or busy. Looking back, I think she enjoyed my company because I noticed practical things, remembered coupons, carried bags without complaint. On a winter trip to the department store, she stopped in the women's section to exchange a sweater for my grandmother. While she argued about store credit, I drifted toward a rack of blouses and touched the cuff of one made from a fabric so smooth it felt like water taught to behave. A saleswoman appeared beside me and said, "That blue would suit your coloring." She meant nothing by it. Perhaps she thought I was shopping for my mother. Perhaps she was one of those rare people who saw a human hand on fabric and addressed the hand, not the category. I muttered that it wasn't for me. She smiled in a neutral, almost bored way and said, "Of course." Still, she had planted a sentence I could not forget. "Suit your coloring." It was the first time anyone in the world of commerce and fluorescent lighting had spoken across the border. I thought everyone else was guarding.
I did not buy the blouse.
I did something more damaging and more common. I stored the moment as evidence for later and went on pretending I had no case to build. College offered freedom the way airports offer freedom. Technically, you can go anywhere, but only if you know your destination. I did not. I lived in a dorm where young men performed carelessness with evangelical commitment. Nothing had wrinkles because nothing was folded. Everything smelled like detergent or stale pizza, or the fear nobody admitted. I found a thrift store off campus during freshman year and told myself I liked it because old coats were cheap. One rainy Tuesday, I bought a dark green skirt and a cream blouse under the cover of knitting pieces for a costume party that did not exist. The cashier was a woman in her 60s with a smoker's rasp and bracelets up both arms. She looked at the blouse, then at me, and said, "Nice choices." Not my size, but nice choices. I nearly abandoned the bag on the counter. Instead, I paid and walked back to campus in a drizzle, so cold it felt punitive. In my dorm room, I waited until my roommate left for the library, then locked the door and dressed in a rush so clumsy it made me feel 13 again. I do not want to romanticize that mirror. I looked awkward. My shoulders were wrong for the blouse. The skirt hung badly. My face still belonged to someone I did not know how to read. But there was relief in the attempt itself, in letting my body ask a question without interrupting it. The problem with relief is that once you have tasted it, ordinary discomfort becomes harder to call normal. I kept those clothes hidden in a duffel bag behind winter blankets. The secret might have remained neatly compartmentalized if not for a roommate's thoughtless kindness. Near the end of sophomore year, he asked whether he could borrow my duffel for a weekend trip because his zipper was broken. I heard myself say no too quickly. He raised an eyebrow. I snapped something about people touching my things. We did not speak for 2 days. Later he came back with a beer and said, "Sorry man, I didn't know you were weird about privacy." He meant to repair the friendship. Instead, he named the real cost of my secrecy. Protecting myself had made me meaner than I wanted to be. That frightened me more than discovery. By then I was dating a woman named Mara, who read novels in bathtubs and could identify trees from half a block away. She liked that I listened fully when she spoke. She once told me I was the least performative man she knew, and I had to turn away so she would not see how badly the compliment hurt. We were together almost 2 years, long enough that truth began pressing against the walls of the life I had assembled. I never told her. That omission is one of the things I most regret, not because I owe every person every private history, but because I let intimacy deepen while withholding the very axis around which my private life turned. The closest I came was one night after a wedding when she kicked off her heels and said, "Sometimes I think women spend our whole lives being told how to arrange ourselves for other people's comfort." I said, "Men do too, though not in the same way." She looked at me carefully, with that alert stillness intelligent people use when they sense a sentence opening underneath another. "Sentence. You mean you do," she said. I laughed and kissed her forehead and changed the subject. We broke up 6 months later over reasons that were not false but were incomplete. Incompatible futures, graduate school, geography, her sense that I was always one room away, even when I sat beside her. She was right. I had become skilled at inhabiting absence. I met Nora at 29 in a municipal office where both of us were waiting to renew licenses after lunch breaks that had already gone too long. She had rain on her coat collar and a paperback in her purse with a receipt sticking out halfway. The clerk's computer crashed, the line groaned, and Nora leaned toward me and whispered, "If they offer to process this in the afterlife, take it, it'll probably be faster." I laughed so suddenly and sincerely that it felt like a bodily event. She was not drawn to swagger. She liked patience, dry humor, the carefulness with which I remembered details about her work and her mother's knee and the neighbor's mean little dachshund. Our courtship unfolded through farmers markets, secondhand bookshops, cheap Thai food, and a winter power outage when we sat in coats under 3 blankets and told each other childhood stories by flashlight. I fell in love with her steadiness first, then with the way she allowed complexity without demanding immediate explanation. It shames me that I interpreted this as permission to remain silent. Love can become another form of delay if you're frightened enough. The first sign that silence might not be as invisible as I thought came during our 2nd year of marriage. Nora worked Saturdays at a community art center then, and I often used the house to clean in the meticulous way anxiety makes feel virtuous. One afternoon, she came home earlier than expected. I was in our bedroom, wearing one of her long cardigans over my own clothes, not transformed, not even trying to be transformed, simply soothed by the weight and line of it while I sorted laundry. When the front door closed, I froze. She appeared in the hallway, took in the cardigan, the basket, my face, and said only, "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." Then she walked to the kitchen and asked if I wanted tea. The kindness of that moment almost undid me. I wanted her to explode, because explosion would have been simpler. Instead, she offered ordinary domestic continuity, and by doing so, she made the truth harder to dismiss as accident. I did not follow her to the kitchen. I took off the cardigan, folded it too carefully, and carried it out as if returning museum property. That evening, she spoke about a grant proposal and a woman at work who kept stealing yogurt from the staff fridge. I answered normally. We both participated in the fiction that nothing requiring language had happened. Years later, she told me that was the first moment she knew silence could become a cruelty, even when no one intended it that way. My father's illness arrived the next year and gave me a socially respectable reason to disappear into duty. He developed the slow, humiliating kind of sickness that makes strong men sentimental about hardware stores and weather reports because those are easier subjects than dependency. I drove to my parents' house twice a week, fixed gutters, filled pill organizers, listened to my mother speak in brisk fragments as if the right tone might keep fear from spreading. Eric visited too, loudly and irregularly, bringing casseroles he bought already made and calling that contribution practical. In crisis, families often snap back into their oldest arrangements. I became the accommodating son again, the one who anticipated needs before they were spoken. One afternoon, while sorting clothes for donation, I found an old photograph from a cousin's Easter gathering. There I was at 8, half hidden behind a chair, wearing a yellow plastic headband Leah had pushed onto me before the adults called us for cake. Everyone else in the photo had forgotten it was there. My mother, standing behind me, had one hand on my shoulder. What I had never seen before was her expression. She was smiling at the camera, yes, but her hand on me was not casual. It was protective and tense at once, as if she already knew life would not let me remain unobserved. That picture unsettled me so badly, I slipped it into my wallet and carried it for months. During my father's final winter, my denial hardened into something almost noble-looking from the outside. I wore flannel, handled paperwork, gave the doctor practical updates, reassured my mother, held Nora at a distance with gratitude instead of honesty. Grief is an efficient cover for many kinds of avoidance. After the funeral, when the casseroles stopped and the folding chairs were returned to church basements, I realized I had spent a year being the son my family needed while becoming almost illegible to myself. Nora did not accuse me. She asked one night, in bed with the lamp off, "Are you disappearing because you're sad, or because sadness is safer than something else?" I said I was tired. She did not press. But I knew then that she had been keeping track of me more faithfully than I had kept track of myself. The birthday gift came 10 months later. I have told you about the box, but not about the hour after. I took the cardigan out first because it was easiest. The knit was fine and cool, the sort of gray-blue that changes depending on light. Nora sat with both hands around her mug and watched me the way one watches an animal one is trying not to startle. I asked how long she had been planning this. She said, "Long enough to know I shouldn't do it unless I was ready for whatever answer you gave me." Then, after a pause, she added, "And long enough to know this isn't a costume." That word made me flinch because it named the lie I had been living inside. I said the only defense I had prepared over the years. "Maybe I just like fabric." Nora nodded, not dismissive, not indulgent. "Maybe," she said. "But I've seen your face when you think no one is looking." No one had ever told me my face contained evidence. I took the box upstairs because I could not bear the tenderness in her voice. In our bedroom, I changed slowly, with the strange solemnity of someone handling inherited china. When I slid the blouse over my shoulders and buttoned it, my hands shook so much I missed one button twice. I clipped back my hair, which was longer than I had worn it in years for reasons I had never fully admitted even to myself. Then I turned toward the full-length mirror on the closet door. I did not see a woman in any simple or complete way. I did not see a man in women's clothes, either. At least not in the reducing sense I had feared. I saw grief first. Grief for how many years I had made myself unavailable to my own recognition. Then, under the grief, a small, clear line of relief. When I came downstairs, Nora looked up and began to cry before I did. Not dramatic sobs, just tears she kept wiping away with the side of her hand, as if annoyed by them. "You look like you can breathe," she said. That sentence changed the meaning of my whole past. Until then, I had thought the story was about clothes, secrecy, permission. In that moment, I understood it was also about respiration, about how long I had been living slightly starved and calling it adulthood. For a few weeks after the gift, honesty came too quickly, and then not quickly enough. We talked late into nights that smelled of mint tea and radiator heat. I told Nora about my grandmother's laundry room, my cousin's pink clips, the cardigan fever day, the thrift store, the play rehearsal, the duffel bag, all the little rooms of my life I had kept locked even for myself. She listened without rushing to categorize me. Once she said, "I don't need you to decide your whole name for this by Tuesday. I just need you not to vanish while you're deciding." But there was a turn I did not anticipate. Once being seen became possible, I panicked at what being known might require. I began insisting on boundaries so rigid they were just secrecy, with better manners. "Only at home," I said. "Only when the curtains are closed. Don't mention it afterward unless I do. Don't look at me too closely." Nora agreed more often than she should have. The arrangement let me keep one foot in truth and one in performance, which meant I spent months stretched painfully between them. The worst argument of our marriage came not because she rejected me, but because she refused to become the custodian of my compartmentalization. She found me one Sunday afternoon sitting in the bedroom half-dressed, blouse on, slacks off, frozen because I had heard the neighbor mowing the lawn and irrationally imagined exposure through sound alone. She said, gently at first, "We can't build a life around your terror schedule." I snapped back that she didn't understand the stakes. She went very quiet. Then she said, "I understand enough to know you keep asking me to witness you and erase you in the same breath. There are sentences that end arguments because they are too true to push against." That was one. She slept in the guest room that night. I lay awake realizing I had made the person who loved me carry the emotional labor of maintaining my false self. Shame had not made me noble. It had made me demanding. The next important change came from language. Nora left an essay on my desk one evening, not as a trap but as an offering. It was written by someone describing the long confusion between liking certain clothes, longing for certain social permissions, grieving an unlived girlhood, and not knowing which part of that knot was identity and which part was adaptation. I read it 3 times. Then I read more. Memoirs, articles, forums full of people trying on words the way I had once tried on blouses, carefully, hoping not to tear them, afraid to admit when one fit. I did not find a single label that resolved me. What I found instead was the permission to stop treating uncertainty as fraud. Some people called themselves crossdressers with relief. Some used other words. Some moved farther across gender than I was ready even to imagine. What mattered most, at least then, was learning that my life was not an isolated defect. I had been narrating myself as a singular failure. Language widened the room. It also made grief sharper. Once you know others have built maps through territory you thought was wilderness, you must mourn the years you wandered without one. Telling my mother was harder than telling Nora, not because my mother was cruel, but because she was so practiced at loving me through roles she had helped create. I chose a Tuesday afternoon in her kitchen because ordinary settings had been the making of me and seemed the only honest places for reckoning. She had onion skins in a bowl and one of my father's old mugs still hanging by the sink because grief had turned many objects into residents. I said I needed to tell her something about myself that was old, not new, only newly spoken. She listened with the tense politeness of someone bracing for bad financial news or a medical diagnosis. When I explained, haltingly, that clothing and gender expression had never sat simply inside me, that I had hidden part of myself for decades, she stared at the table and said, "I thought if I didn't shame you, maybe it would go away, or maybe I had imagined it." There was no malice in it, only an exhausted confession from another generation's vocabulary. Then she said the sentence that hurt most precisely, because it was not theatrical. "I don't know what I missed a chance to protect you from." I reached for her hand, and she let me hold it, but she did not squeeze back. Not then. We had to cross a colder stretch before warmth returned. For several months our conversations became careful and domestic, all weather and soup and neighbor gossip, as if the truth had made language fragile. Then one morning she called and asked, practical as ever, if I wanted to buy you a sweater for Christmas. Would I look in the same places I look for mine? I stood in my kitchen with tears coming so suddenly I laughed at myself. It was not perfect acceptance wrapped in a bow. It was better. It was effort. Eric was more blunt and, in his way, more bewildered. He said, "So are you saying you want to be a woman?" I said I was saying I had spent my life policing myself into a shape that did not hold everything true about me. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "That sounds like one of those answers smart people give when they don't want to answer." He wasn't wrong. At that stage, I still wanted language to spare other people discomfort without sacrificing myself entirely. We did not speak for 3 weeks after that, not from fury but from mismatch. Then he showed up at my house with a drill because he had heard the porch step was loose. While we worked, he said, "I don't get it, but I do get that you've been miserable longer than I knew." It was the nearest either of us had ever come to tenderness without a project in our hands. Families rarely heal in speeches. More often they heal beside broken wood, under hoods of cars, while discussing something else. The first time Nora and I left the house with me dressed in a way that felt openly, undeniably mine, we drove 40 minutes to a town where nobody knew us and spent half the trip in near silence. I wore dark trousers cut for women, a soft plum top, small silver earrings, and a coat that made my shoulders feel less like a claim I had to defend. We chose a botanical garden in late spring because flowers seemed easier witnesses than people. At the ticket desk, the young man glanced at us, smiled, and asked whether we wanted a map. Nothing collapsed. No one pointed. A little girl in a sun hat handed me a dropped brochure and said, "Here you go, ma'am," then ran back to her father before I could respond. The word landed in me like a pebble thrown into a deep well whose depth I had never measured. It did not solve me. It did not crown me. But it revealed how much of my life had been organized around avoiding accidental recognitions that now, when they came, felt less like insult than invitation. Later, over soup in the garden cafe, I started crying into my napkin because the waitress had asked, "What can I get you ladies?" And I could not explain to Nora why kindness from a stranger hurts so much. She understood anyway. She said, "It hurts because you have a backlog." That, too, was true. I had a backlog of unlived ease. Not every step afterward was forward. There were weeks when I retreated, convinced I had confused hunger for selfhood with hunger for relief. There were mornings when my own reflection felt complicated and provisional again, when every available word seemed either too small or too final. Once I told Nora maybe the whole thing had been magnified by anxiety and loneliness and old habits. She listened, then asked, "Are you calmer when you hide, or just more familiar to yourself?" I could not answer immediately because the answer indicted so much of my life. Familiar misery had always seduced me by looking responsible. Around that time, I began keeping a notebook, not of outfits or plans, but of sensations, memories, and the social weather of each day. Who had I been with? What name or pronoun people used, if any? Whether I felt constricted, relieved, conspicuous, unseen. Writing it down showed me patterns I had spent decades blurring. The issue was never merely that certain clothes comforted me. It was that certain forms of presentation allowed parts of my personality, posture, voice, and attention to emerge without the constant drag of correction. I was kinder when I wasn't monitoring my wrists. I was more